Hey, what's up guys, Gareth here from The Sound Guy, and hopefully you have caught our actual blog post prior to jumping to this video, because the blog post kind of covers a little bit more in detail where we actually apply some real life application to loudness and how we actually use loudness, and within a reference point about, well, so many real life applications, from throwing a grenade to trying to identify how loud something actually is, which is on the premise of how to actually pick a speaker. So I'm going to assume that if you're getting into DIY, because that's what this is all about, it's about teaching people the fundamentals about speakers and choosing speakers. If you might just want to buy a new hi-fi, understanding the specifications goes a long way. But if you're into DIY, like a lot of people who are following this channel and go through our page, the likelihood is you are going to build something, or you're looking for a replacement product. So how to pick a replacement product or a suitable driver for your next project is kind of all explained within the blog section of our website, which I'll share the link below. Right, so for this example, what I've done is I've pulled up 3 basic spec sheets, because I've explained in the blog post how we can actually identify watts as not how loud it's going to be, right? So it's more seen as a potential to how loud something can get, which we discussed in relatively good detail. We also then had a look at things like sensitivity, which is the measure of how loud something is based on 1 watt worth of input. And again, we kind of broke down a couple of different drivers to see which one of those drivers were the loudest. And now we have kind of rounded ourselves off to 3 imaginary speakers that fit our price point, as well as our size for our application and so forth. So now we've got our 3 drivers, we need to start making a decision, and essentially we need to now go and put our specs into some form of software to actually understand how loud is loud, and which one is going to be the right one for us. So what I've done is I've pulled up 3 basic spreadsheets, guys, and they're in no particular order, so please do not think of being biased in any way. I literally have picked 3 random drivers. So the first driver that I've pulled up is the SAN 184.03. This is a neodymium driver from Loudness. It is an 18-inch speaker, okay, as one of our drivers to reference at. The next one being the Fein Colossus 18XP. I'm actually busy with the design for this particular driver right now. A customer has some really old horns, really well made, but they are absolute tanks. They were overbuilt, over engineered, and pretty heavy to move around. And we're going to be doing some revamping of some new cabinets and doing the designs for them. Right, and just to really complicate things a little bit, we are throwing in a 12-inch driver to use as our reference as we go through the explanation for our drivers. Right, so one of which we discussed potential, really, which is our watts. So for our Loudness driver, we're going to go down on a spreadsheet and we're going to look at this AES power rating. And I can see here that we have 1,500 watts of potential loudness that we can use. And our sensitivity, which is 96 dBs. So for every, when we test our speakers as to how loud they are for a value of 1 watt, we are essentially measuring 96 decibels, okay? Our Fein Colossus 18XP has less power handling, being 1,000 watts a yes, but it has a higher sensitivity of 99 decibels, which looks really good on paper. And in theory, to have a subwoofer measure out, or a low frequency driver to measure out at 99 decibels, we can honestly say is quite impressive, with most good speakers measuring out at about 95, 96, 94 dBs in PA applications. So dropping into our 12-inch, we have 300 watts worth of power or potential, and we have a sensitivity of 96 dBs, right? So when we're looking at the spec sheet, we can say that the driver with the highest level of potential is in fact our Loudness driver. Next on that is going to be our Fein 18XP with 1,000 watts of potential loudness. and our little 12-inch with its 300 watts of potential loudness. However, we know that this is potential to how loud something can get. If we were to consider which is louder per watt, well, we know that we have 96 decibels on our 12-inch, and we know that we have 96 decibels on our Loudness driver. So in theory, the Loudness and the P Audio 12-inch, the 12BM 300B, are basically as loud as one another when we look at 1 watt's worth of input, with our loudest speaker per watt essentially being our Fein Colossus 18XB. Now in the blog side, we actually explained how to calculate the maximum loudness based on the sensitivity to our power handling to actually define which is the loudest, at least mathematically. But speakers are a little bit more complicated than just working out how loud something can be, because we have all of these spec sheets, which could seem quite daunting. Again, guys, if you're getting into DIY, it's really important to understand that so many software is available to you at your disposal that you don't actually really need to understand what you're doing in terms of what all these specs mean within the spec sheets. You just really need to understand on how to interpret the graphs. So a lot of the times when I explain things, I will try and explain things so that someone really young can understand if they're getting into speakers, and hopefully enough information for someone who is a little bit more senior and taking their builds a little bit more seriously, getting into things right. These videos aren't aimed at anyone who is experienced. All right, so you need to take this data that is available on your spreadsheets and or on your PDFs, your spec sheets, and you need to clock them into your software, right? Now I've loaded up 3, again, random drivers in no specific order. However, I have kind of stuck to the Loudness speaker. So we've got a Loudness speaker that is loaded in, and it is the SAF 184.03, which is the Ferrite version of the actual PDF that we've used, right? Just to show you, it doesn't really matter what you load, it's how you see the data. Then we've got our BNC 18DS115, which is an absolute colossus of a speaker. I've recently had the opportunity to actually use it and test it in a Paraflex, and to be honest with you, it is a pearl of a driver. While it might not necessarily belong in a Paraflex, we'll save the conversation for another day. Ultimately, it's designed for small compact cabinets for touring, and it's quite an interesting speaker to work with as a whole. And sometime, you know, when you look at spec sheets, they seem like wonderful products, and just because it is a great product, it's a great engineering product, doesn't necessarily is going to be the right product for your application, and we'll save that for another video, right? So we've got our Fein, our BNC, as well as a Loudness driver. All 3 of these speakers are 18s, and I've preloaded the data in. So just to give you a bit of a hint, if you have followed the means and the tutorial or the step-by-step instructions as to you know, how to enter your specifications in, if you're not really too sure, you can actually see getting started with your design and so forth. You know, winisd does have like a little bit of a tutorial on how to do things. What you want to do just to help you along is you want to click on entering your own drivers, follow these steps. As long as you make sure that you follow the steps, you might find that there will be discrepancies on some spec sheets, but most importantly, what I want you to identify is that if you've loaded all the information and winisd has accepted it without changing anything, when you actually start off and you start going to a speaker, right, you might find, let's just use some data which is preloaded on winisd, that is going to give you a driver integrity fail. Okay, don't worry about that. What's most likely happening is that when you load the specifications and you enter in the voice coil height as well as the actual gap height itself, right, winisd will automatically calculate that to its actual middle, right? It doesn't necessarily take into another step which is included within a lot of specification sheets, which is how they actually define the usable BL, right? So if we look at the BNC spec sheet, you will see that they will give you an Xmax and XVAR, which essentially is telling you the difference between, you know, where we start to lose BL at least to a point where it starts to become, not so usable. So a lot of the times you'll see that the specification sheet will say that the cone displacement is rated out to 12 millimeters. But when you do the calculation and or you enter in the information to winisd and it does the calculation, you might find that winisd will give you a smaller number, so your Xmax might come out to 7.5, whereas your spec sheet might say that it is 9 millimeters with the cone displacement. So just keep that in mind, double check on that information. It might be what's causing the error a lot of the times. Okay, so once you've loaded your drivers, you're going to need to start off somewhere, and winisd will actually give you some form of predefined box size relevant to some other specifications, which I'm not going to cover now because I'm going to skip all of this and we're going to really focus just on the topic at hand today, being loudness. Right, so once you've loaded up your drivers, and the good process to start off is think about how big you want your box to be, right? Now, it takes a little bit of practice, but with a bit of practice, you are going to be able to understand, how big a volume is. And it might be easier for you to work in cubic foot, or it might be easier to work in liters. I prefer liters because visually I think in meters when I'm talking about big cabs, right? So I know a speaker might be 0.8 meters by 1.2 meters by 0.5 meters, and it's very easy for me to calculate the volume back into liters. So again, you can use any basis measurement that you want, and you can change that down at the bottom end of the screens by double clicking on the unit itself. And as you can see, we're going from cubic foot to centimeters to meters cubed back into liters, right? So in a predefined box, please understand that this is not necessarily the best thing to do. As a matter of fact, it is not recommended to do, right, guys? So as you get into speaker box design, you start taking things a little bit more serious. You will understand that every speaker needs its own box to come out to its right tuning. So one glove does not fit all speakers. Very important to understand. But for the sake of this example, I'm going to pretend that we have a box already which is 150 liters, and it is in theory tuned to 40 hertz. So we're going to be taking 3 different speakers and popping them into the same box, and this is how we're going to compare which is louder or better for the existing box that we have, rather than design a new box relevant to each speaker to see how loud it can get, right? So as you can see, we are 150 liters for our Loudness, we are 150 liters for our BNC, and we are 150 liters and tuned to 40 hertz for all 3 of our drivers. When you start off looking at your winisd drop down menu, right, you will see that the first graph is referred to as the transfer function magnitude, and this is how winisd talks about frequency response relevant to box size and tuning. In other programs like Bassbox, it might be called the normalized amplitude response. Even though it's different words, it's basically talking about the same thing. Right here, we don't see how many dBs worth of loudness we can go. Rather, we draw an imaginary line through what we could assume being flat, right? And if we change something, we can see what's happening to the frequency response and its relative loudness, right? So 0 being flat and true, and if we've got a bump that goes into the positive, we can think of this as having adding loudness to the system. By how much? Well, you can click on the driver, right? Click somewhere on the graph, and you will see in the top right hand corner here, it will say 52 hertz or whatever you've clicked on. It doesn't really matter. So for example, I can click over here, I can see up top here, this is 40 hertz roughly, and I'm minus 1.3 dBs. Or if I click, let's say over here, roughly we are at 60 hertz and we plus 1.28 dB. So it's not telling you, you're 110 decibels. It's rather telling you, with changing all these parameters into the box size and tuning, that you might get a little bit of extra loudness at certain frequencies. Okay, so looking at this graph, you can't really say that one speaker is louder than the next speaker, even though that we can clearly see that one speaker is in fact a little bit louder, right? We're not looking at overall loudness, we're just looking at, you know, the frequency response of our enclosure itself. And this is where it becomes really complicated, because a lot of people who are just getting into DIY will often jump into this screen particularly, and they will start to tune in and go, you know, let's go out to 300 liters. Okay, you know, can I go a little bit lower? 30 hertz. Okay, what about 30? You know, bugger this, let's go down to 25 hertz. No, it's a little bit too soft. And what happens is that you land up assuming that that is actually how low the speaker can go, which is not wrong. If you measure it with the microphone and it's built, you know, and everything comes out right, you might very well measure that very same response that you're seeing over here. But it's a little bit complicated, but I'll try and touch on this topic in the video briefly. Right, so hopefully this first graph explains itself. It's not showing you how loud it is, it's a reference simply to the frequency response to some form of flat, right? So you can see whether you're going louder or softer, relevant to frequency. Right, what we need to do is we need to go and click on the SPL graph. The SPL graph, again, if you followed in the blog side of things, we used a reference to define how loud something is with a given value of 1, right? So in this instance, we have got a value of 1 watt. Now, it's important to understand, and often gets quite confusing, is that when you actually look at a spec sheet, and let's go and use our Loudness, right? Now, remember what I was making reference to, the Xmax Loudness actually rates the speaker out, I think, to 13 millimeters or 12 millimeters. But if we use the standard calculation without adding on the height or the gap height, divided by 4 or divided by 3 for some brands, this will often be a little bit lower, right? So let's go jump into, well, we don't have that spec sheet, so you know what, I'm going to put it down as 12 millimeters, and this is where it might give an error. But what I want you to look at over here is that there is 2 values for SPL. There is USPL and there is SPL. Now, it might be confusing because we've spoken only about one form of SPL, but the secondary level of SPL is quite simple actually. We are looking at 3 8-ohm speakers, right? Nominal impedance of 8 ohms. However, we have a DC resistance, which essentially is what the lowest impedance your amplifier would see. So if, for example, our lowest impedance was 3, right, and we click somewhere over here, we can see that our overall SPL is changing slightly, specifically our USPL, because it's now looking at the minimum impedance. So while you might see a difference in those 2 SPLs, simply put, it's looking at the lowest impedance. I'm just going to cancel this, we don't want to save any of that, right? So based on our nominal impedance, winisd is giving us some form of loudness, right? Now, firstly, we've loaded 3 subwoofers, and it's going to be a really good practice to get you guys into the habit of doing something like this. Because as you become a little bit more advanced, you understand that if you're working with a subwoofer and your next project is going to be maybe a 2-way to go along with that, or perhaps you are building a 2-way or a 3-way, and you know that speaker 1 is going to do all of your sub bass or your very low frequencies, then you're going to have something which is going to focus more on your mid-range, and then you're going to have a tweeter. While it's simple for us to understand that a tweeter doesn't really play mid-range, and a mid-range doesn't really play sub-bass or high frequency, it plays kind of in the mid, as it kind of says in the name. And our bass speaker doesn't play any of the other 2, respectfully. So what we want to do, or as you get into the swing of things, you might want to click on simulate voice call inductance when modeling your speaker. What simulate voice call inductance is doing is it is essentially looking at the impedance curve itself, or doing a prediction of the impedance curve, right? And it is kind of summing up where we will start to lose high frequencies. So it's a good reference when you are actually looking at a component system, or you're going to use a speaker with other speakers, as to what you might have to work with. Now, keep in mind that this is a simulation, and oftentimes your simulation might differ from what you actually read in the spec sheet. So it's very, very important to actually go through the modeling process once you have selected your speakers. Okay, so I've now included this into our graph. Right, now when we're looking at our transfer function magnitude and our SPL graph, essentially they are giving us the same answer, right? And I want to just change this quickly just so it's a little bit easier to see right now. And I want to go and look at our SPL range, and I want to change this to not 90, let's make it 120, right? Just so we zoom in a little bit more onto our graph. Okay, so loudness changes with frequency, guys, and when you look at a spec sheet and it gives you a sensitivity of 100 dBs, we need to understand that that 100 dBs could have been measured in so many different ways. Hopefully it is done to an AES standard, because AES essentially is the pinnacle and the most correct way that we can measure things. It's pretty late, so I'm going to take a sip of my coffee quickly. Much better. All right, so when comparing the loudness of sensitivity, when we start to look at our graphs, we will see that sometimes things don't always match up, and this is why we start to model. So with all of our drivers, we have a slightly different frequency response, but we kind of hit this point somewhere around here where we can actually see that they are all the same loudness, right? So let me just click away here. They're crossing each other. Okay, so with 1 watt worth of inputs, all three drivers, which are very different in terms of price point, in terms of power handling and general specifications, but they all actually are about the same loudness. If you look in your top right hand side again, 44 hertz, call it 45 hertz, right? On 44 hertz, we are roughly 94.5 dBs for all three speakers. If we were to go and click, let's say for example over here, our Fane as well as our Loudness driver are pretty much the same in loudness at 60 hertz being 95 dBs, and our BNC driver has got a little bit of a dip, right? And it is 94 dBs. While again, reflecting on our blog side of things, we can see that sometimes, you know, the one with the most watts is not necessarily the loudest per watt, right? So going back to the blog post, we realized very, very quickly that we could calculate how loud something can potentially be if we know the sensitivity and we know the actual power handling of the driver. We can use the 10 log formula to calculate, you know, based on how many watts we have and how loud we were as our reference, how loud we can get based on our potential power handling. Very easy to understand using the 10 log formula, right? Now, you don't need to know that maths because, again, there are free calculators. You can use a free calculator to do this. But what I want you to pay attention to is that within every given size box, right? If I make the box smaller, I am controlling the actual movement of the cone a lot better, right? I'm potentially stiffening up that spring, that air in that box, right? And if I change the tuning frequency, I am also again changing how that air is springy inside that box, because we tune it. We kind of like, you know, changing the resonance of the actual system itself. And because all three of our drivers are loaded into our generic box of 150 liters, right, so we can start to see something happen when we look at our maximum power, right? Because we want to see how loud we can get. Now, we worked out that if we don't consider any other parameters outside of potential and sensitivity, that we could get to a certain value. But what about the speaker inside the box? Well, in this particular instance, we can see that our BNC driver has a potential power handling of 1700 watts AES, and it can handle that 1700 watts. You can see it's got a straight line all the way through right down to this point over here before we start to run into problems with cone displacement. Now 35 hertz, let's call it 35 hertz to keep it simple. winisd is actually showing us that we can handle the full 1700 watts, which is pretty impressive for any speaker, in all honesty. If we go and have a look at our loudness speaker, without using the full cone displacement, we kind of run into a problem. Okay, and this is really important to start understanding spec sheets, guys. Again, our driver, it's either 12 or 13 mils, and I want to bump this up to just show you how important cone displacement actually is. So I'm going to go to driver, edit, parameters, and loudness, please don't hate on me, but I know it's 12 or 13 millimeters, somewhere around there. So just for the sake of interest, we're going to change it up, something which is more relative to what's posted on the data sheet itself. Right, you will notice that this graph hasn't changed, and winisd can sometimes be a bit finicky. What I need to do is I need to click on another graph, and if I come back to this, you will see that now the graph has actually changed. So very important, if you don't see anything changed and you've changed some information, click on something else, come back. Right, so now the fact that we've got more cone displacement, we can see we no longer have that dip. Right, so now we've thrown in the third factor as to how loud we can get. And now in this instance, we can see our SAF 184.03 is also using its full power potential down to 35 Hertz, 34 Hertz, right? When we have a look at the Fane Colossus 18XP, which is still, in all fairness, an excellent driver, we know that we have 1000 watts worth of power or loudness potential, but we have a problem when it comes to cone displacement. We in fact are running out of cone displacement within our box. Just to reiterate, that changing the box size will change this outcome also. I'm going to go from 150 liters down to 75 liters, and you can see that now we have more cone control over the driver. And I'm going to move this back up to 150 liters, and just like our box volume changes the amount of cone control that we have, I'm going to go from 40 liters and I'm going to tune it to, let's say, 55 Hertz. 150 liters, 40 Hertz tuning, to keeping the box to be 150 liters to 55 Hertz tuning. So you can see, just by changing either one of those parameters relevant to the cone displacement, it changes our potential power handling before we run out of cone displacement. So cone displacement is the third variable that we are throwing in to our selection on how to actually pick a speaker relevant for your application, which changes things a lot. It makes things definitely far more complicated than just looking at how much power we have and how much sensitivity we have, right? So knowing this information now, we actually have the third factor, which kind of throws the stick in the wheel, because now we can't necessarily use that calculation anymore. So we have to take a step back, because if we don't have cone control and we start exceeding Xmax, essentially we are introducing distortion, and that is something we do not want. Gentlemen, if I can give you a solid piece of advice, when you are designing your enclosure, it's very important to understand that these speakers with these astronomical levels of high cone displacement are terrible to work with, because one, they often produce more distortion the further out they go, and that is completely undesirable. However, if going for low frequency is really the task at hand, then you need a driver with lots of cone displacement. Okay, just because you have more cone displacement doesn't necessarily mean you are louder. It's just better suited to produce longer wavelengths, right? Because that speaker has to move a given amount at a certain level of power input, right? So now we're going to use this graph and we're going to bring this loudness level into tow, because only two of our speakers can utilize its full potential power handling, with the third speaker showing us that, hey man, although you're 1000 watts, you're kind of going to run out of cone displacement if you're going to put me in this box. So keep in mind, I can only really go out to about 839 Hertz if I was tuned to 55 Hertz. But you know what, you're throwing me into a generic box which was tuned to 40 Hertz, just as all the other speakers are going into, right? So because it's tuned to 40 Hertz, I can only really handle about 540 watts before I run out of cone displacement. So what you can do now is, right now our graph in terms of our SPL is looking at 2.83 volts for a nominal 8 ohm impedance. It kind of does it differently in winisd, where it actually looks at the lowest impedance to try and give you a more fair or a more accurate prediction as to what the amplifier might see in terms of impedance. So if your graph sometimes looks a bit weird and your SPL is not where it should be, just know that it's not necessarily looking at the one nominal impedance. It might be looking at your actual DC value of your voice coil, and it can be this way for many different software applications, so make sure you are identifying which one it is. All right, so we know that our Fein was what, I might have to go back here, maximum power 540 watts. All right, so we're going to drop back down to our SPL, and we are going to go to signal and put in 540 watts. Right, now we've shot out of our screen. Don't worry, that's an easy fix, because we're really going to start shooting out. We know our Voce driver is rated at 1500 watts AES, and our BNC is rated out to 1700 watts AES. Okay, now we need to come back to our settings. We need to go and have a look at our SPL, and let's bump this up to about 150, right, which is high levels of loudness, right? So we can see here that by understanding our potential loudness and based off our sensitivity in a generic box, we understand that the cone control is a big factor, or cone displacement is a big factor of how much of that potential we can use before we start running out of mechanical, and we run into issues when it comes to cone displacement, right? So what is the loudest speaker now? Well, it's kind of tricky, because even though our BNC driver can handle more watts, it's actually about the same level of loudness as our Voce speaker. So having the extra 200 watts really didn't account for anything if we look at our potential loudness. With the Fein driver, right, we can see that we definitely are softer. So you know what, our two premium drivers are kind of crossing run about here. So what is that, 47 hertz, right? So our Fein driver is producing 122 potential dBs worth of loudness based on 539 watts, right, 540 watts. Where our two drivers, using their full potential, they are essentially at roughly the same point, you know, 127 dBs worth of loudness. Okay, so hopefully guys, this makes a lot of sense to you. If not, you know, try and go back to the previous discussion that we kind of covered in the blog post if you don't understand how sensitivity and watts kind of correlate to one another, and how we can calculate, you know, based on our thermal potential of our speakers. And hopefully you understand when you're looking at loudness that your first graph, being your transfer function magnitude, kind of shows you how the system is going to be tuned to. So if you change your box size, let's say from 150 liters down to, you know, 75, you can see the frequency response changes. The same thing can be said if we keep to the same box size, but we change the tuning, let's say to 55 hertz. Again, the frequency response changes. Okay, but it doesn't necessarily tell you how loud it is. The graph that you actually need to use is your SPL graph to determine how many watts, you know, at what level of watts your input is, as to how loud the driver and the box are going to play as a combination. And that essentially is it, guys. Remember, maximum power, or sorry, maximum power shows you relevant to the amount of watts that you have to work with, right? If we assume that we are going to apply the full amount of watts in our given box size based on our given tuning frequency, will we have any issues with cone displacement? Very, very simple. If we see that we are going to run into problems with cone displacement, well, then we know that we can't really use the full power potential, like the instance within our Fein, right? So our Fein only being able to really handle about 543 watts of its 1000 watts AES rated power. We had to change our loudness that we could turn up to, because we don't want anything to fail mechanically. Now there are ways to address this by doing things like adding filters, but filters, I'm going to assume by the time we get to this conversation that you understand completely what is happening with the balance of your designs, because that ultimately is an end goal thing that we try and introduce to maximize our performance of our driver and ultimately lower distortion and increase its protection. Okay, well guys, that really is as simple as it gets. If there's something that you do not understand, please feel free to leave your comments or your questions in the comment section of YouTube, or you can respond on our blog post. If you think this is of any use to you, to help you learn or help someone else learn, please give it a like and a thumbs up and a share. From myself, till the next video where we start going a little bit further into some other topics relating to speaker building and sound in general. Adios.